Before we finally endorse expectation damages, we need to consider an alternative remedy, specific performance. One way to ensure that the promisee gets exactly what she wanted is to order the promisor to perform. Let's begin with UCC section 2716. First, the code makes specific performance available when goods are unique. This part of the section mirrors the traditional common law rule. Courts have always allowed promisees to seek specific performance for unique items such as artwork, heirlooms, and specially constructed machinery. But what about Lucy against Zemmer? Why was specific performance ordered in that case? It's because land is also considered unique under the common law. I've shown it in parentheses here because real estate transactions aren't governed by the code. UCC section 2716 also adds to the traditional scope of specific performance. It invites courts to order specific performance in other proper circumstances. As the official comment makes clear, this provision was a self-conscious effort to make the rule more liberal. Comment 2 explains that it's the inability to cover that determines whether other circumstances are proper for an award of specific performance. For example, ordering specific performance might be appropriate if the promisee wouldn't be able to cover in time to avoid significant losses. Finally, why do you suppose that specific performance is a buyer's remedy and not available for sellers? The reason is that the seller of goods gets cash, and money is fungible rather than unique. Thus, from a seller's standpoint, monetary damages deliver exactly the same remedy as would an order of specific performance. Now let's see how courts apply the rule. You read Klein against PepsiCo. In that case, Klein arranges to buy a corporate jet from a broker who in turn planned to obtain it from PepsiCo. PepsiCo refuses to deliver. We can speculate that the company chairman probably decided that he liked having the jet after all. It's awfully nice to be able to call for a plane to pick you up when your commercial flight's been delayed. That's how the other half of the top 1/100th of 1% lives. The trial court orders specific performance in this case, but the Fourth Circuit reverses. How would you have argued that this transaction doesn't involve unique goods or other proper circumstances? Please pause the video now to write down your answer to this question. The court's reasoning is a good guide to the best lines of argument. The plane wasn't unique because 3 comparable aircraft were on the market at the time of the breach. These aren't other proper circumstances because Klein simply wanted the jet for resale, and rising prices alone aren't a reason for specific performance. Crucially, Klein could have obtained cover, and monetary damages would adequately protect his interest in PepsiCo's jet. As it turned out, Klein waited and eventually chose to buy a G3 instead. Since he doesn't get specific performance, let's consider briefly what damages Klein would receive. Suppose that immediately after the breach, Klein could have paid an additional $50,000 in brokerage fees and purchased a G2 for $6 million rather than $4.75 million. If he sues PepsiCo for breach, what does Klein get in the way of damages under the expectation rule? Well, under UCC section 2713, he'd receive the contract market price differential, or $1.25 million. And under UCC section 2715.1, he should get the incidental expenses associated with obtaining substitute performance, or $50,000. Remember, though, that the language reasonably incurred in section 2715 creates some doubt about whether a court will award the full hypothetical cost of covering. But would even our full hypothetical cover damage measure completely compensate Klein for all of his costs? No. He'll inevitably suffer some delay and inconvenience, plus litigation costs. He also faces some uncertainty about recovery. The code requires that he act in good faith and without unreasonable delay to make a commercially reasonable substitute purchase. And it bars him from recovering any loss that could have been prevented by cover or otherwise, or of which the seller had no reason to know. These rules imply some risk. But would specific performance necessarily be any better? Quite possibly not much. Again, he'd bear the cost of litigating, he'd necessarily experience some delay in awarding the remedy, and once the court orders performance, he would need to worry about the quality of that reluctant performance. So problems exist for the promisee with both monetary damages and specific performance. The choice is far from clear. We'll revisit that choice in a moment. But first, you also read Sedmak against Charlie Chevrolet. Recall that the Sedmaks negotiate with Tom Kells, a manager at Charlie's, to buy one of a limited number of the Indy 500 pace car edition of the Corvette. The Sedmaks are Corvette crazy, with 6 of them in their collection. The parties agree that the Sedmaks will pay the manufacturer's suggested retail price, which will be about $15,000. At the dealership's request, the Sedmaks pay a $500 deposit and get a receipt. They also ask for special equipment, including the engine type, the transmission, and a tape deck. Given that it's the late 70s, probably an 8-track. The car arrives and Kells tells the Sedmaks they have to bid for it. He's already received calls from Hawaii and Florida offering $24,000 and $28,000 for the car. The Sedmaks sue and succeed on a claim for specific performance. A valuable bonus in the court's opinion is a review of indefiniteness doctrine. As you read, all you need is a method for determining price. In this case, they agree on the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And we also get a nice discussion of the part performance exception to the statute of frauds. On our facts, part payment is enough to take the entire contract outside of the statute of frauds. When there's just a single unit, quantity isn't a disputed issue. So partial payment is as good as full payment for verifying the existence of a deal. These cases help us to understand the carefully limited circumstances in which courts will award specific performance. But a puzzle remains. Why do we see such a strong preference for damages? The excerpt from Alan Schwartz in the notes argues that specific performance should be the norm rather than the exception. There are some reasons to think that might be a good idea. First, ordering specific performance better protects the promisee's subjective valuation of the goods or other performance. It may be quite difficult to measure how any individual values one item as opposed to another potential substitute. If you get the originally promised performance, then we don't have to worry about whether you had special reasons for wanting it. We might also use specific performance to punish bad breachers. If we think the promisor has behaved opportunistically, then ordering specific performance tends to deter that kind of breach. Alan Schwartz adds 2 important arguments to these fairly obvious ones. First, doctrinal limitations like foreseeability and certainty make monetary damages undercompensatory. Specific performance eliminates this risk of undercompensation. Second, he cleverly argues that specific performance is self-limiting. Promisees will be reluctant to seek specific performance unless damages are seriously undercompensatory. Recall our discussion of what happens when a contractor is losing money on a construction job. The promisee should anticipate a lack of cooperation and diligence from any promisor who's been ordered to perform. This is a clever argument that suggests we can safely let promisees decide between specific performance and money damages. But consider more carefully the concluding sentence of the Schwartz excerpt in the textbook. Promisees would seldom abuse the power to determine when specific performance should be awarded, because of the strong incentives promisees face to seek damages when these would be even approximately compensatory. Can you think of any other less benign reason to seek an order of specific performance? The promisee could instead be looking for a strategic advantage, a bigger payment to excuse performance. If performance has become extremely costly, the promisor may well be desperate to avoid performing. This sort of strategic demand for specific performance is a far more serious problem than Schwartz's analysis assumes. Although quite clever, I don't think his argument is ultimately convincing. Charlie Getz and Bob Scott argue that we should think instead of remedies through the lens of the mitigation principle. They point out that the promisor could always purchase substitute performance herself and tender it to the promisee to satisfy her performance obligation. Thus, the promisor has a choice to perform and lose or to breach and pay. Why then would a promisor ever breach? Getz and Scott's clever idea is that when a promisor breaches, it's a cry for help. The promisor is signaling that the promisee can cover more cheaply. The rule of expectation damages allows the promisor to make this choice and pay the price in damages. The promisor has a strong incentive to pick the cheapest option because that will reduce the costs of breach. And mitigation or avoidability rules encourage promisees to help, since they can't recover avoidable losses. The genius of this approach is that it links the damage rule to the broader goal of limiting the social costs of breach. It builds on the purpose of mitigation doctrine and gives a clever account of why it's good that expectation damages let the promisor elect between breach and performance. Beware, though, that the American rule on attorney's fees may distort this choice. The promisor could assume that the promisee won't sue for breach because it's too costly, or that the promisee will settle for much less than the full value of her claim. On this reading, an opportunistic promisor might be saying, "Catch me if you can," rather than issuing a benign cry for help. Notice, though, that awarding specific performance isn't likely to help the victim of such a breach. If you can't afford to sue for damages, you also can't afford to sue for specific performance. Thanks for listening.